We do have three generally recognized top American writers of the 20th century in this section, in Pearl S. Buck, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway. Buck and Hemingway both won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Fitzgerald probably should have. Fitzgerald and Hemingway certainly the two perhaps greatest names in American 20th century fiction writing. I would put Faulkner in there myself as well, but Fitzgerald and Hemingway are often identified with each other. They're both in the lost generation group of the 1920s, and I'll have a lot to say about both of these writers. But we're going to start off with Pearl S. Buck. She is the first American writer ever to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Her name does not loom really large among the greatest writers now. However, her name is remembered for her famous novels of China, particularly The Good Earth. And she turns up in a couple of our textbooks. The mention of China is important because if you look at the little write-up, you can see that she grew up in China. Her parents were missionaries, and she knew China and other Asian countries very well. She understood, as you can see in her stories, their culture and their way of life from an American's perspective. The Good Earth was about a Chinese peasant who became rich. I've read that. I have not read its sequels. There are a couple of other stories about his family. And it was largely on the strength of that novel and her understanding of the Chinese peasant culture that she won the Nobel Prize, which is given to the person judged as the best writer in the world, his or her entire body of work for that year. So it's quite a prestigious award. The Enemy, of course, is set in Japan. We have a Japanese surgeon and his wife and servants, and it's about how they treat an American who is in a very vulnerable position. And to give it an extra turn of the screw, Buck sets the story in World War II. As we can see from the title, it's a blunt one. It makes clear what the whole theme of the story is about. Americans and Japanese in those days were enemies, and either a person from either side, if he came upon an enemy from the other side in that war, certainly would feel that the thing to do for his country was to eliminate that person. This moral issue, what to do about this when the person is in a weak and vulnerable position, and even more if you're a doctor, whose profession, of course, is devoting to helping others and saving their lives, is what Sadao faces in this story. In this video, we're going to be introducing the story in Pearl Buck, I just did, and looking at very roughly the first third of the story. The beginning of the story makes it clear that we are in Japan. She does what authors often do. Rather than trying to make the reader wonder what's going on, she immediately sets the place and gives an idea of the person's situation. However, it takes a while before we realize exactly when in Japan's history we are, and that this was when Japan was aggressively trying to conquer the entire Pacific Ocean, basically, and a great deal of the eastern part of the Asian continent, and when, as I said before, all Americans were enemies. This started, of course, with one of the most infamous events in American history, the Pearl Harbor attack. The U.S. had stayed out of World War II up to this point. We had watched the struggles in Europe and Asia from afar, a lot of debate over what to do, whether to enter the war in Asia on the side of the Allies. And then Japan made it a moot point by attacking our base in Hawaii without any provocation, without any warning, making it inevitable at one of the most, I'm sure, strongly patriotic points in American history. I've heard about people lining up the next day to join the armed forces, making it certain that we were going to respond to this and that we had to go to war. In our lifetime, of course, the closest thing to this is 9/11. But Pearl Buck has an interesting twist here. She is an American. She could very well have written this from the American point of view. But what she does so cleverly in this story, and it shows how sensitive she was, and it shows how her upbringing in China gave her an international outlook and an ability to understand Asian cultures, is that she describes this from the point of view of Sadao, the Japanese man who saw Americans as the enemy and who was completely comfortable, it seems, and not questioning of Japan's aggressive attempts to conquer the entire area. This is made clear in the first scene. There's a little flashback. As I said, the first sentence sets the scene immediately. Dr. Sadao Hoki's house was built on a spot of the Japanese coast. There's his name, his profession. In theory, he could be an academic doctor, but we do soon find out he's a medical doctor, and his nationality. And there's a little flashback, as I said, a very short one, which I think is an important one because the islands come back in the story in the end as a final image. There are islands out there, and his father would say to them, they are stepping stones for the future of Japan. Our future is whatever we can make it. Sounds like something patriotic Americans might say about our country achieving things. But it turned out to be much more sinister. Japan wanted to conquer those islands militarily, as well as conquer other countries in Asia like China, Korea, Thailand, Burma, countries where they still remember what the Japanese did in a very negative way. And so Sadao grew up. He became a surgeon and a scientist. And very importantly to the story, he went to America. He didn't go to America because his father felt positively about the United States. He went there because, as the narrative says, education was his chief concern, and this was the best place to be educated. Sadly, it's not as true as it used to be. I've taught a lot of foreign students here in the U.S., so many of them still come, but it used to be that America was the country to go to from anywhere in the world if you wanted to be well educated. Now Sadao is back in Japan. The war has started. Why was he not sent abroad with the troops? Because the old general, who becomes important later on in the story, needs him specially. So it's not for any reason of compassion. There is no sense of compassion in this story until Sadao and his wife react to the American soldier. It's simply because the general rather selfishly thinks, I like this doctor, I need this doctor in case I get really ill, and so he's going to stay on the home front. The appearance of Sadao's wife continues the exposition. You'll remember that that's the word for the background to a story, the author setting the time and place and what we need to learn about the characters. It's important because Buck says, right column in 479, he had met Hannah in America. Again, there's that connection with America in both of their pasts. But the sentence continues interestingly. He had waited to fall in love with her until he was sure she was Japanese. That means fully Japanese. He obviously would have recognized her as Asian. The question was she 100% Japanese? Because the next sentence shows the racist and nationalist attitude of his father. His father would never have received her unless she had been pure in her race. Kind of funny, waited to fall in love with her. If it's true love, a man can't do that. They met at the American professor's house, and the idea about the professor being kind to them, which becomes important later on, Hannah as another student, is briefly mentioned. They came home, only got married after the father had approved of her, married, first words in 480, in the old Japanese way. So it's very important to follow his father, and even though he had lived in America, to follow Japanese culture and even Japanese ideas, of which they still have a little, of racial purity. This division in Sadao between his American experience and his Japanese background is at the heart of the story. What happens following exposition? Inciting incident, the event which gets a story going. And Buck jumps us right into it. They see a man out in the water. He's crawling. He falls down. And when they come, they find that it's a man who's badly injured. But just as shocking as that, a white man, not a Japanese fisherman who's been hurt, but the enemy. In fact, the man has been shot. Sadao can see that it's a gun wound. And this contrast between the characters is important. I'll say a little more about it later. Hana says, top of the second column, "Oh, how he is bleeding." The man's suffering and her feelings for him are the important thing to her, but to Sadao, this is an enemy. This is an American, or at least a white man. What's he going to do? What shall we do with this man, he says. And then a few lines later, he finds out that he's American because the words U.S. Navy are on his cap. It's clear that Sadao is working against his feelings, that he would rather be kind to him, that he would rather treat him and save him as a human being and as a patient. He keeps on talking about what an enemy he is. It would endanger all of us if we did not give this man over as a prisoner of war, Hana says practically. And he says, denying the truth, I would not think of doing anything else. They take him into the house. They find out that he's still alive. And Hana is still frightened for what might happen. Don't try to save him. What if he should live? She's afraid for her children, for their safety. And then Sadao talks about washing him for the operation. And that is when the servants are introduced. There are two important other reactions in this story to compare and contrast with Sadao's. One of them is his wife's, and the other one is the servants'. The servants are looking after the household, after Sadao and Hana's children. Might be a weakness in the story, I think, that the children never really become characters. Their reaction might have been interesting to the strange situation, the secretiveness in the family. Hana, I think, trusting and loving her husband, and also, of course, having been in America herself, is sympathetic to the American soldier and follows her husband's lead in saving his life and treating him. But in order to show that this is not the only possible reaction, that there are Japanese people who would be extremely negative on helping an enemy, Pearl S. Buck wisely puts these servant characters in as a contrast. And so Hana is asking Yumi to fetch hot water and so on, and then when Yumi is asked to wash the soldier, she says, top of page 482, I have never washed a white man. And later on, my master ought not to command me to wash the enemy. Now this point about command is important because these people are Japanese. And a part of Japanese society, and it still is to be very obedient and never to question authority. And so for the servant not to do that, to say, well, this is a wrong command. Now, that's something an American might do. You're commanding me to do something immoral from my point of view, so I'm not going to do it. But it's a very extraordinary thing for a Japanese servant to say. Stupid Yumi is Hana's reaction. It is not a white man. It is just a man. And this lack of the racism and narrow point of view which Sadao's father obviously had is very important in the story. Hana seems comfortable with it. Sadao goes back and forth, especially at the end, as we'll see later. I think the really interesting thing in there dramatically is the contrast between Sadao and his wife. His wife, of course, has never had to assist at an operation before. There's blood. He's cutting into a person. Of course, she's made very upset. She's made sick by it. But her husband says, if I stop now, this man will surely die. And so she has the strength to come back from actually getting sick because this is so appalling to her, because her husband said it's necessary for his life. Again, she looks at him and thinks more compassionate human things than the sort of things that Yumi thinks. On page 483, she thinks the man is suffering. She knows that the propaganda of her country is that the Japanese soldiers are always liberators, that the countries they conquer are happy to see them march in. This, of course, is completely untrue, and she even has a sense that maybe it is. As a woman, she thinks in personal details, even in gossip. This one general beats his wife, doesn't he? If we Japanese can be cruel, then perhaps it's not the right thing to do to always treat enemies as enemies. Sadao, for his part, is simply being a doctor here. Buck describes his professional instincts taken over. He is talking to him as a patient, my friend, my patient. He's just working as well as he can because that's what he feels he should do. And I think that's the second motive that Buck gives him. The first one is the same as his wife's, compassion toward a wounded human being. The second is that it's his job, he wants to do it well, he's trained to do it well, and at the end of the operation he has done it well and said, this man is going to live. But of course there's going to be the question of what to do with him, and that is what takes up the whole rest of the story.